evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Ambassador Series event. Many thanks to our strategic partners at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center for their wonderful hospitality and the provision of this beautiful venue to hold our public programs. These are filmed for nationwide broadcast on our television show World Affairs Today, and will be distributed globally on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and other digital platforms. Today we welcome to our podium His Excellency Ramon Macaya Hayes, Ambassador of Costa Rica to the United States. Along with several other Central American countries, Costa Rica declared its independence from Spain in 1821, and Costa Rica achieved full independence in 1838. In 1948, Costa Rican President Jose Figueres officially dissolved the country's military, redirecting the budget to invest in healthcare, education, and environmental protection. Since Costa Rica has gained its independence, it has worked with the United States to achieve goals based on shared values of democracy and free trade. Additionally, the United States and Costa Rica have collaborated on issues such as reducing the effects of climate change and protecting biodiversity. Today, Costa Rica ranks as the 12th happiest country in the world and also boasts the greatest density of different species in the world. His Excellency Ramon Macaya Hayes was sworn in as Ambassador of Costa Rica to the United States in August 2014, presenting his credentials to the U.S. President in September of that year. He has had a multiple disciplinary career as a scientist, a businessman, advocate, politician, and academic. He served as Chief Investment Officer for the private equity fund Mesoamerica, Director of Business Development at ICIC, General Manager at RIMAC, and Managing Partner of the healthcare consulting firm Sanagist. He has also participated in numerous panels and meetings held by the World Health Organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and the World Trade Organization. He holds a PhD in biochemistry from UCLA, an MBA in healthcare management from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, and a BA in chemistry from Middlebury College. Our discussant for the program is Michael Shifter, President of the Inter-American Dialogue. Prior to joining the Inter-American Dialogue, Mr. Shifter directed the Latin American and Caribbean program at the National Endowment of Democracy. Additionally, he directed the Ford Foundation's Governance and Human Rights Program in the Andean region and Southern Cone. Since 1993, he has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, where he teaches Latin American politics. Please join me in giving me a warm welcome to Michael Shifter and Ambassador Ramon Macaya Hayes.
Well, I'd like to thank Stephanie for that very generous introduction, and thank all of you for taking the time to be here tonight. I was asked to give a few remarks on sort of the history of Costa Rica and how we got to where we are today, and what are our challenges and opportunities moving forward. But before I start, just to get sort of feel for the audience, I'd like to ask for a show of hands of who's been to Costa Rica. Okay, so we've got maybe a third of the audience. Who would like to go to Costa Rica? All right, this is my kind of audience. Well, Costa Rica is a small country. We're about the size of West Virginia. We're nestled in Central America, between Panama to the south, Nicaragua to the north. We have 5 million people as of March. And we're a country with no oil, no gas, no minerals, no real extractive industries. And yet we've achieved some interesting indicators. We are a stable democracy. In fact, we just had an election on Sunday. I'll get to that at the end. We're a peaceful country. As Stephanie mentioned, we abolished our army back in 1948. And we're a stable country, economically, socially, and politically. We're a middle-income country today. We have an educated population with over 97% literacy rate. We have health indices of a developed country, even though we're not a rich country. And we're recognized for our conservation efforts. So a lot of people ask, well, how did Costa Rica get there? And if you go back to our history and look at the decisions that were made on policy, it's a pretty self-explanatory story. Costa Rica, in the early decades, took a while to get its traction in setting policy. We obtained our independence from Spain in 1821, and then we joined the Republic of Central America, the Federation of Central America. And we're not a fully independent nation until 1938. But then it wasn't until a decade later, until 1848, that we became a republic, so an independent republic. And then we had an invasion, 1856, by William Walker. And that was our real battle for independence and freedom. And then after that, we had an outbreak of cholera. And so if you can see the first 4 decades, essentially, we were sort of gaining traction and trying to first to really consolidate our sense of nationality. But one of our biggest first policies was a big bet on education. Back in 1869, we made education mandatory, free, and paid for by the state. So if you think of this country, a coffee-growing country back in the 1800s, deciding that we wanted to educate the population. And that included both boys and girls. And so it was a very progressive measure, especially for the time and the region. If we fast forward to the 1940s, this was a very turbulent time around the world, and Costa Rica was not the exception. In 1941, we had a 3-way negotiation that took place between the ruling party in office at the time, the Communist Party in the opposition, and the Catholic Church. So think of that 3-way negotiation taking place. And out of that came our social guarantees, which established our labor code. A lot of our labor rights that we enjoy today were established in that negotiation. It established created the University of Costa Rica. This was furthering that bet on education, but now higher level education with a public free university, which still are one of our most important universities. And we established our national healthcare system, which initially covered only workers, and then through a number of steps in different administrations was increase the coverage of this healthcare program to include first workers' families, and then the unemployed, and then the poor, and then legal immigrants, and then undocumented immigrants if they were pregnant women or children. And more recently, the latest expansion in coverage was to cover partners of the same sex. And so today we have something that's virtually universal healthcare coverage. We had a civil war in 1948. And it was very short. It only lasted 40 days, but it had very consequential outcomes, especially as to what happened after the Civil War. The winning side of the Civil War, led by Pepe Figueres, established a second republic after the war was over. And one of the big decisions was to abolish the army, as we've already discussed. And this created this peace dividend that allowed us to invest more sustainably and at a higher level in education and in healthcare for all the decades that followed. We've bet on renewable energy. Last year, 2017, we closed our year having generated 99.7% of our total electricity from renewable resources. Most of that is hydroelectric, and then we have geothermal from our volcanoes, wind, biomass, and just about 0.3% from fossil fuel. We also started to implement some very interesting policies to promote conservation. we had been deforesting our nation very quickly because we were promoting policies that would increase our agricultural exports. But the downside was that we were clearing our forests at a record pace. So we decided that we had to create a balance. And so we started creating national parks. We established our national park system. That was done with guidance from the United States. And then we started to implement these policies that would get private landowners to enter the conservation effort, so that they needed an economic incentive. So they needed some form of income for conservation. And that came from a tax on fuel. So fuel is taxed in Costa Rica. You pay at the pump. And that goes into a fund that is distributed to landowners that leave their land idle to conservation. And then a second source of income was generated through water rights. So any farm that might have underground water could receive payments if they protected the forest around these aquifers. And the source of that income was water rights. So bottling companies or even the hydroelectric plants would have to pay for the water they used, and that money went to the private landowners that conserved water. And the effect of this policy was dramatic. From 1986 to 2012, in a 26-year period, we increased our forest coverage from 21% of our landmass to 52% of our total territory. So we more than doubled our forests. And at the same time, those same 26 years, we almost doubled our population and we tripled our GDP. So we had economic growth, we had population growth, and we had forest growth, all going in the same direction. It was a very successful policy, and the one that is being looked at by other countries. As I mentioned, we have health indices of a developed country. We have long life expectancy. It's slightly longer than the United States today, even though back in the 1960s, we had a life expectancy at birth 8 years below the US. And the older you get around anywhere in any country, the older you get, the longer you can expect to live. You're in a new cohort, a new average. But it's especially true in Costa Rica, to the point where the cohort of 90-year-olds in Costa Rica has the longest life expectancy in the world. And it's a factor of the men. In pretty much every country, women outlive men, and that's also true in Costa Rica, but the gap is narrower. And so a 90-year-old man in Costa Rica can expect on average to outlive a 90-year-old man in Japan or Europe or the United States. And we're not really sure where that effect is coming into play or why it's happening, but it's a fact. We have a blue zone in Costa Rica. These are zones that have exceptional longevity, where many people live beyond 100. There's only 5 blue zones in the world, and the largest geographic blue zone is in Costa Rica. And happiness is always an issue. You know, the term pura vida is sort of an expression of that, but we usually rank in the top 10 countries in the happiness index. If I were to ask people on the street, what do you think Costa Rica exports? You usually get agricultural products, you know, as a reply: coffee, bananas, pineapples, and all of those are important. But today, our main exports are tourism, if you want to consider that an export, high-value services. These are very sophisticated services. It can be engineering, design, human resources, finance, and so forth. And then as far as a manufactured product, our #1 export today is medical devices. So we export heart valves and surgical instruments and all kinds of very sophisticated, precise products. We have a very close relationship with the United States. It's our #1 trading partner, our #1 source of tourists, our #1 source of foreign direct investment. Costa Rica has a large expat population. About 150,000 U.S. citizens consider Costa Rica home. And Costa Rica is the #1 destination for U.S. students in Latin America and 8th in the world. All of this is sort of a result of those sort of out-of-the-box decisions that were made politically throughout our history. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have any problems. We certainly have problems, as any country. I'll just name a few. We have a big challenge with obtaining. We've done very well with renewable energy when you look at electricity, but in transportation, we're still burning fossil fuel. So we have to electrify transportation, putting an electric train, promote electric cars, a hydrogen bus, and so forth. And a lot of these initiatives are just gaining traction. We have a problem with security. This is public security related to the drug trade. We are in the pathway of illicit narcotics. And that has generated problems, especially in the last few years, because these drugs are coming through our Pacific waters. They're coming from South America on the way to North America. They enter Costa Rican waters, and collaborators along the way get paid with drugs. And that starts a very vicious cycle. We have a big issue with mobility in the Central Valley. As people get more prosperous, they can buy cars, and Costa Ricans, we are buying lots of cars, and so we have a traffic problem. And it's not a joke. I mean, this is a big issue, and certainly something that has to be addressed, because it's an issue of quality of life. The fiscal situation is another issue that we have to deal with. As all of these social programs, healthcare, education, gain traction and become more sophisticated, sometimes they also get more expensive. And we have an aging population that has implications in healthcare expenditures, in pensions, and obviously impacts our public finances. As I mentioned, we just had a presidential election this past Sunday. For the second time in our history, voters can vote outside of Costa Rica, so we received lots of voters at our embassy on Sunday. And the election was not decided outright in this Sunday. So for the third time in our history, we are going to have a runoff election between the top two candidates on April 1st. You need to reach 40% to win outright, and no candidate reached 40%. So it'll be between two candidates, Fabricio Alvarado and Carlos Alvarado. They're not related, but they have the same name. But for the first time, the two traditional parties that have always been strong in elections are not, neither one is in the runoff. So certainly, this is an interesting election, to say the least. But I would say that we've evolved from a two-party system to really a pluri-party system, where in any given election, you can expect 4, maybe even 5 parties to have a chance at winning the presidency. So I'll leave it there so that we can start our conversation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and I want to thank also the World Affairs Council and Stephanie for the invitation. When I was approached to be discussant with Ambassador Macaya, I jumped at the opportunity. He's been a good friend and somebody who is highly respected and has done a terrific job for his government here in Washington, not always under the easiest circumstances. So we want to, it's really an honor to be with him in this opportunity. And we'll have a chance to get your questions, but I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about where you left off on the elections. And first of all, say that all of the achievements that you mentioned, I think, are the envy of many countries in the region. And it really is quite remarkable what Costa Rica has done and what it's accomplished in many, many areas. And it is kind of seen as a model, I think, throughout the region. And but it's becoming a more interesting country, as evidenced in this election. As you said, candidate one who doesn't come from traditional parties, somebody who was just a month ago or 2 months ago was somebody who was seen as not having any chance of winning, and now he got the highest vote count last Sunday. And it seems, at least from all the analysis that I've read, that the real reason for this was a court ruling of the Inter-American Human Rights Court, basically on same-sex marriage. And he was a candidate who strongly opposed that and tapped into a sentiment in Costa Rica that enabled him to get the first to get the most votes in the first round. The first round is always different than the second round, and I'd like to get your thoughts maybe on what we should look for as we go into this runoff on that will take place Easter Sunday, April 1st. Will that still be the issue, do you think? Will some of the other questions you raised, like crime, security, the fiscal budget deficit, and other issues, the economy in general, become more important? What do you expect to be the sort of the key issues in the second round of the election?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I knew the exact answer to that, but let's compare the first round to what will be the second round. The first round had 13 parties, so we've gone from a system where there was usually two parties that had any chance of winning. There might be other parties that used to run, but they usually didn't have any chance. But as I mentioned earlier, now there are usually a group of parties that might have a chance, and that was certainly the case this time, because neither one of the two main ones for the first time ever are in the running in the second round. So once you get down to just two parties, you don't have the dilution effect. I mean, when you have 13 parties, in this case, the winning party obtained around a quarter of the votes, but you need 40% to get to the outright election, to win it. So when you have two parties in the runoff, there's definitely going to be a winner, regardless of how many people vote. It's just the half plus one. That's the rule. So I think turnout will be a big issue, especially given that it'll be Easter Sunday, and this is a big holiday in Costa Rica. And sort of do other issues become part of the discussion? Economics and safety and transportation and aging population and pensions. I mean, there's many subjects that people are worried about or concerned about, and I would say that in the next few weeks we'll hear. I can't predict what's going to happen.
This election was the first one in Latin America in 2018 that's going to be a very packed electoral calendar cycle, starting with Costa Rica and then looking to Paraguay, Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico in July, Brazil in October. And I was wondering if you could, when you look at these other, sort of taking a broader look in the region and look at these other elections and the politics, to what extent do you see certain common features? Because in other countries, people are talking about the rejection of political parties, kind of discontent with the political class, also fragmentation, looking to build coalitions, independent candidacies, the kind of really shaking up the more traditional political kind of establishment, which seems to be happening in Costa Rica, which is reflected in this election, as you mentioned in your comments. Do you have any thoughts about how Costa Rica, in relation to these other countries that will be having elections in 2018, is maybe shares some characteristics, and in what ways is it distinctive? Obviously, each case has its own particular conditions, but is there a sort of a trend or tendency that Costa Rica is perhaps part of?
Well, as you mentioned, each country is a unique case. There are many countries in Latin America that will have elections this year, and they're very different from each other and different from Costa Rica. But perhaps one commonality is the power of social media. That's certainly definitely a force anywhere in the world, not just Latin America. And how that is addressed, how that is used in a campaign certainly can make differences. I think the diversity of parties is also on the rise. That seems to be a global phenomenon. But, despite the fact that we had an unusual election in terms of the number of candidates that had a real chance of winning, there was one thing that did not change in this election in Costa Rica, and that was people's faith in the system. After the election, I mean, this was, a hard-fought election, as they all are, and yet once the polls closed, everyone was very calm, very relaxed, waiting for the count to be completed. There were no self-proclamations, no victory announcements. Everyone waited for our Supreme Electoral Tribunal to release the results. Once they were released, those that were not favored by the results accepted the results, conceded the election, congratulated the winners that will move on to the second round. And so that, I'm glad to say, is very Costa Rican and has not been lost.
No, I think that's an important issue that distinguishes Costa Rica. There's still a kind of a democratic, very strong democratic culture in the country. You mentioned the security issue and the organized crime, and of course it should be clear that Costa Rica does not have anywhere near what some of its neighbors have in Northern Triangle in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. But still, seems to be something new. I mean, what do you think? What have been some of the policies or approaches that have been pursued by this government of President Solis to try to deal with this, and what have been the results? Because clearly we've seen in other countries, if the situation gets out of hand and really becomes very severe, it really puts at risk a lot of the agenda, both political and economic agenda of a country. So what has been the experience of this government in trying to address this question?
Well, it's a multidisciplinary problem. It starts with, you have poverty, you have temptation, you have people that are offering easy money for entering criminal networks, and so increasing our ability to collect information, surveillance at sea. A lot of we have a bigger presence in our oceans today, and that's increasing. That was essentially a free-for-all. Anyone could pass through Costa Rican waters, and it was very difficult to detect them. But those capabilities are going up. We've certainly done a lot of interdiction work, but this is a problem that we are not going to solve strictly through interdiction. We cannot interdict our way out of the problem. So social programs are part of the equation in dealing with addiction, in addressing poverty, There are some very interesting reforms that were implemented in this administration to change the way assistance is provided to the most poor citizens in Costa Rica, so that they didn't, the agencies that are responsible for this didn't simply wait for citizens to arrive to request help. There was an outreach to the communities, to the poorest neighborhoods, and defining poverty in a very broad, multidisciplinary way. It's not just income, it's really what do you have access to and what do you not have access to. And so it's a slow process. We can't solve the problem overnight. So part of it is sort of the interdiction and the intelligence and the sort of trying to dismantle criminal networks. But the other part is social. It's creating better educational opportunities. It's trying to get people out of poverty and create a safety net so that poverty is not something that pushes you into peddling drugs.
I want to talk a little bit about the relations with the United States. Costa Rica and the United States has 12 free trade agreements with countries in Latin America, and with Costa Rica is part of the Central American Free Trade Agreement, so-called CAFTA, which I know was pretty contentious in Costa Rica, was a big issue, but it did get through. And I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts about what you think the impact has been of that trade agreement. To what extent has it been helpful for Costa Rica, and how do you see its importance?
Well, one thing that we have to keep in mind when CAFTA was implemented, it substituted another program which was called CBI, the Caribbean Basin Initiative. So Costa Rica had broad access to the U.S. market in a number of products, even before CAFTA. But CAFTA made it a reciprocal relationship. It may have consolidated its legal, standing, and trade has been increasing for the past, 30 years, even prior to CAFTA. Now, one question you haven't asked me, but is, what do we think is going to happen in terms of the possible revision of trade agreements?
Right.
And there, I think there's a difference between CAFTA and other trade agreements, for example, NAFTA. When NAFTA was implemented, that was a new agreement. I mean, Mexico and Canada did not have the access to the U.S. market as they do today under NAFTA, whereas Costa Rica already had a pretty good access to the U.S. market even prior to CAFTA. And the United States has a very strong trade surplus with Central America and with Costa Rica under CAFTA. In fact, the U.S. already had a trade surplus even before CAFTA, but that trade surplus increased after the signing of CAFTA. So there's another difference with NAFTA. In NAFTA, for example, Mexico has a trade surplus with the U.S., but it's the other way around under CAFTA. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we think it's been a relationship that's part of our overall relationship with the United States. We have a strong trade relationship. It's a two-way street. We export a lot to the U.S. in medical devices and services and fruits and agricultural products. We get a lot of other sources of income, tourism. So it's part of our U.S. relationship, and the U.S. relationship is one of the most important relationships internationally that Costa Rica has in terms of trade, tourism, visitors, permanent visitors or residents, and so forth. So I would think that that it's probably not going to change much. One thing I'd like to say is that despite all of the noise that we hear out of Washington, when you look at really what's happened concrete between the United States and Costa Rica on the bilateral relationship, not much has changed. On the multilateral setting, a lot has changed, but that's dealt with in the United Nations or OAS or other forums. But in the bilateral setting, not much has changed.
If you can comment a little bit about, Costa Rica is a small country, part of Central America, which is a set of small countries with altogether about 30 million people in Central America. One of the things, the President Solis actually wrote a paper for the Inter-American Dialogue some 25 years ago about integration and the challenges and the obstacles to pursuing integration. And that continues to be, and I looked at his paper recently, and it struck me how much of it is still quite relevant 25 years later. Could you just comment about sort of the challenges of greater integration in Central America, in Latin America, in general? It seems that in order to be a more effective player globally, that to the extent that Latin America could work together with among its neighbors, that it would enhance its position. What are your thoughts about that whole challenge?
Well, there's a big opportunity with integration, and President Solis is an integrationalist, as you know. If you look at, for example, trade between Costa Rica and the rest of Central America, that's our second biggest trading partner after the United States. I mean, the U.S. is a huge market, big country, much higher level of income, but what we trade with the rest of Central America is second place. If you look at individual countries, it's not, but if you take all of Central America together, it's a very interesting market. And so if trade barriers were decreased and we had better logistics throughout Central America, it would certainly enhance probably all economies. But politics gets in the way. We've been negotiating a customs union for decades now.
Right.
And there's always some political issue that doesn't allow us to conclude a negotiation that, if it were concluded, could be very beneficial to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask a final question before we open it up. I can see people on the edge of their seats, anxious to pose questions. The role of China. Costa Rica recognized China a number of years ago under the Oscar Arias administration, and it was the only Central American country to do so until, I guess, Panama, if you consider that Central America, just a couple of months ago. Tell us a little bit about the relationship, Costa Rica and China. Where has it been? Where is it headed? How you see the increased engagement of China in your country, as well as more widely throughout the region?
Yeah. Well, that's a question that comes up a lot in Latin America: is how much is China involved in increasing trade or a presence in Latin America? And China has made investments in Costa Rica, and there was a road to our Atlantic side of the country that is going to be built by the Chinese. And there's been other projects that have been discussed, but a lot of the investment of China in Latin America is in countries that are rich in natural resources, whether it's oil or minerals or timber or something like that. And as I mentioned in my talk, our natural resources are biodiversity. They're the forests that we're not going to touch, because that's what attracts the goose that lays the golden eggs, which is all of you as eco-tourists. So it's a different type of economy, and it's very service-oriented. So it's I think that changes the way China engages with a country like Costa Rica versus other countries that are much more oriented towards the export of raw materials from their natural resources.
Great. Well, thank you very much. This has been extremely interesting, and since I've asked all the easy questions, I've left the hard questions to our very well-informed and engaged audience. And so if I could ask people if they want to pose a question or make a comment to Ambassador Macaya, there's a microphone here on the left. You can please queue up. Yes, please, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, my name is Dominic Cardella. I'm retired, but I love to travel. And the last time I was in your beautiful country was probably about 10 years ago. And you mentioned that tourism is your #1 industry. And for a country that prides itself on their ecotourism, I have to say that as much as I love your country, you have some of the most hazardous roads of any country I have ever been to. You have potholes that would almost swallow up your car, and when you're in those beautiful mountain ranges, there are roads some roads washed away, and if you're not careful, you can disappear. And it's sort of strange that, as I say, for a country that prides itself on their ecotourism, that you don't improve your roads.
Well, that's a very common comment. And I have to agree that a lot of our roads could certainly be better. Now, I just want to frame this by explaining how challenging it is to keep all roads in, good paved conditions. We have about 45,000 kilometers of roads, whether they're rural roads in the mountains, streets, highways, and so forth throughout our country. Less than 1,000 of those kilometers are sort of highway type roads that you could provide or you could offer as a concession in the private sector, where a toll would be put in and they would start paying for themselves. So the maintenance of all these roads has to come from general taxes. Now, when you're coming as an ecotourist and you want to go to a very remote area in the mountains, by definition, you're going to be into a very curvy, mountainous road that is not in an area densely populated that's generating taxes that would be able to pave that road. I mean, we can do it selectively, but doing that throughout the country is a tremendous challenge. So I would encourage you to come back. I think the roads have improved, maybe not to the extent we would like our roads to be, but they have improved. We have some new highways, new ways of getting to certain places. But keeping this infrastructure in tip-top shape is very difficult because we want to be able to get everywhere, and in Costa Rica, you can get to any point in the country in a car. But the downside is that means if you want those to be in perfect condition, all these roads would have to be paved, and we don't have the tax base to do that.
Maybe we'll see roads as a issue in the second round of the campaign. That'll be Thank you. Yes, please.
Good evening. My name is Patrick Ray-Lisa with the UN Association Program Chair for the Sustainable Development Committee. Ambassador Macaya, thank you again for your conversation. As you know, my work involves the youth and the Sustainable Development Goals, and you spoke at our program in Georgetown in September. Can you say a little bit more about the Costa Rican youth, what they're doing? Are they getting involved in the SDGs? And also the Costa Rican American youth here in the United States? Thanks.
Yes, good question. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are something that Costa Rica has taken very seriously. After they were established in the UN, there was a series of meetings in Costa Rica that were organized. These were led by, at the highest level, by the President's office, a national commission headed by the President, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of the Environment, and the Minister of Planning chair this commission that basically monitors the advancement towards the goals. And Costa Rica had many stakeholders involved in this, all the government agencies, the private sector, faith-based organizations, NGOs, and so forth, and became the first country to ratify the Sustainable Development Goals. And the youth is very engaged in this. This is something that really motivates millennials, is getting to 100% renewable energy and now working on transportation. How can we electrify transportation? Working on healthcare. I mean, all of this takes innovation. But if you look at Costa Rica's history, it almost appears that Costa Rica has been working towards the Sustainable Development Goals since our independence. I mean, we bet on universal education in the 1800s, 4 years after the U.S. Civil War. We were trying to educate girls in Costa Rica. We made healthcare universal. We've promoted conservation. We became the first tropical nation to reverse deforestation, and on and on. All of this before the Sustainable Development Goals were established. So it's a natural fit to really energize the country and say, okay, these are the goals. We're all getting behind this, and let's try to achieve them.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Olivia Anderson, and I'm a research associate with the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. Thank you for coming today, Mr. Ambassador. My question regards the percentage of abstention votes that were in the election, which I believe on Sunday was about 34%. And I was just wondering if you think that is something related to the discussion of same-sex marriage and kind of that controversy. And then going forward in this second round of the runoff, how do you think the abstentions will play out?
Well, the abstention rate was actually fairly normal compared to recent elections. If you look at the past 4 elections, abstention rates have been similar to last Sunday's. So it didn't go up, it didn't go down. There was a higher abstention rate outside of Costa Rica. So what we saw coming to the embassy or consulates throughout the U.S., and there were actually 52 consulates around the world that had Costa Ricans coming to vote in 42 countries. There we saw a very high abstention rate, but there are other reasons for that. I mean, people live sometimes far away. They come to a consulate to renew their passport, and they change their electoral direction, but they probably don't have a realistic expectation to come to vote because they might be in a different state. Sunday was also not the best day for an election here and in New York, which is where we have the biggest Costa Rican community. It rained, it snowed, we had freezing rain at one point, we had the Super Bowl. We were competing with the weather and other factors. But nationally, which is where the bulk of the votes are, abstention was not that different. Now, what's going to happen in the runoff is anyone's guess. I can't speculate there.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Sajid. I work for the federal agency. I'm a U.S. government employee. And I've been to Costa Rica, and it is a great country. I really enjoyed the sightseeing trips, including the roads. I like it there too. So I have a question. I know that Costa Rica don't have a military, so how are you going to defend yourself if attacked by neighbors? Because the U.S., we spend $600 billion for defense, so it's totally contradictory. A country not far from the U.S. has no military.
That question is a very good one. We defend ourselves in different ways. We defend ourselves through the international system of law. And in fact, we just had a recent ruling in the court in The Hague, International Court of Justice. In fact, our deputy chief of mission led the case, or was one of the participants in the team that defended Costa Rica's interests in this case, which was defining our maritime boundaries with Nicaragua, our northern neighbor. And also another issue which had to do with, and this was some land territory that was claimed by both countries, and where in fact our northern neighbor had troops in what is now unquestionably Costa Rican soil. And we won those court cases, but this requires patience. We have to establish or put together a good legal team. It's expensive. It's time-consuming. It takes a long time. This event where there was an incursion into Costa Rican territory took place in 2010. And so, you have to wait a few years for the ruling to actually take place. But that is how you live without an army. You rely on the multilateral system and you trust international institutions.
Has there been any calls for establishing an army in Costa Rica? Is that an issue, or nobody proposes that?
No one proposes that. Costa Rica, I mean, if there's something that's in our DNA is a vocation for peace, and anything that smells like a sort of a heading down that path towards the military has immediate antibodies. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Amanda Brown. I'm a policy assistant at Brownstein Hyatt. You mentioned that very early on, Costa Rica took a big bet on education for both women or for girls and boys. But by some indices, women are not that active in the economy in Costa Rica or not that well represented. So I wanted your perspective on women's involvement in the economy and what efforts that Costa Rica is taking to empower women in the workforce.
Yes. You're right. There are certainly areas where women are not participating at the same rates as men. We've been trying to promote more women in the STEM fields. We've tried getting more women involved in the political process. Of these 13 candidates for president that ran on the Sunday's election, only one was a woman. The other 12 were men. Although for the vice president, we have in Costa Rica we have 2 vice presidents, and in every single party there was parity. So there was a man and a woman vice president in all parties, but only one party had a woman running for office, the maximum office. Although we have had a woman president, so it's not like this is impossible in Costa Rica. There's some interesting signs of change. There are many majors, some in the STEM fields, where now there are more women in college studying these majors than men. So I think it's just a demographic change that's going to come with the millennials. As we have this relay of generations, we'll see more and more women participating in business, in academia, in politics.
Yes, hello, Ambassador Macaya. Wonderful to see you again. And just briefly, I've heard about some tremendous strides your country has made in the biopharma area, most notably with a papilloma virus trial that seemed to be very successful. Just a brief comment on that. And then for those of us that would like to know more about the blue zones, where is that city and how easy is it to get there? Thank you.
Well, you mentioned a very interesting study that took place in Costa Rica, which was the study that definitively linked the infection of the human papillomavirus to cervical cancer in women. And because our healthcare system is well organized and everyone's accounted for and everyone goes to the same healthcare system, we have a lot of data, we have a lot of ways of contacting patients, and the National Cancer Institute established this program in Costa Rica to study the link, and it has followed 10,000 women for many years to look at infection rates and then progression towards cervical cancer. And then the vaccine was developed, and it was tested in Costa Rica, and many women signed up for this. Most of what we know about the disease and most of what we know about the vaccine was an outcome of these studies in Costa Rica. And one of the outcomes was that it's a 3-dose vaccine, that 2 doses were enough. So WHO, the World Health Organization, today recommends 2 doses versus 3 based on the Costa Rican study. Well, now, just this past December, NCI just started a new trial to see if 1 dose is enough, because if 1 dose is enough, this is going to be rolled out across the world to bring cervical cancer rates down in many countries where the logistics of getting 3 doses is tremendous. So it's an example of where a well-organized system in a small country can have a major impact in the practice of medicine. And going to your second question on the blue zone, this is the Nicoya Peninsula. So it's on the Pacific coast. It's a peninsula, as the name implies, and it's 5 counties. So it's the largest geographic blue zone in the world. And they just had a conference there and studying the similarities between these 5 blue zones on the planet. And as I mentioned, you know, this cohort of 90-year-olds in Costa Rica has a very exceptional high longevity. But you can't move to Costa Rica when you're 89.
Hello, my name is Diego. How can we, what's the difference between the population in Costa Rica and the population in America with their trust to the government? How does the people in Costa Rica trust the government more instead of the American people?
Your question is, do people trust the government more?
Yeah, more, yeah.
I think that depends on who you ask. But one thing that's very important is, regardless of what your feelings are, your opinions, how you feel about the government, you can express yourself loud and clear in Costa Rica. We are among the strongest countries in the world in freedom of the press. They had a recent ranking of all the countries of the world, and we came in 6th place after the Scandinavian countries. You know, one thing that you can be assured of is that in Costa Rica, when you don't agree with the policy or the government, you can express yourself loud and clear, and nothing is going to happen to you.
Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Ian Su, and I'm a college student from Columbia University, majoring in political science, international relations, and I originally came from China. So I'm very interested in the last topic that you talked about the relationships between China and Costa Rica. So I have 2 questions. The first one is, can you explain more specifically about the service-oriented economy? Besides the tourism, what other services does Costa Rica economy provide? And the second question is, has the democratic relationship between People's Republic of China and Costa Rica been influenced by or have had influences on the democratic relationship between Costa Rica and the United States? Thank you.
Yes, I'll answer both questions. The services, so after tourism, which is a big part of our economy, it generates about $4 billion in revenue for our economy. Something that's about equal to tourism is these exportable high-value services that are set up in what we call shared service operations. These are centers that are established by multinational companies to produce a service that is used for the entire global company. So it might be managing the human resource department, managing finance, accounting, engineering, design. Some of these are very sophisticated services. For example, Intel, the chip manufacturer for computers, they had established a plant, an assembly plant for computer chips in Costa Rica back in the late 90s. And they operated it for 16 years until 2014. And then during that time, the market changed from exporting to the U.S. to exporting to Asia. So a decision was made at the corporate level of Intel to move this plant to Asia. This was a big concern. This was a big investment in Costa Rica. But Intel did not leave Costa Rica. They stopped manufacturing in Costa Rica, but they implemented many new services in Costa Rica. So now Intel designs its computer chips in Costa Rica. And it has a lot of the innovation processes that they have translated to what now they call the Intel Mega Lab, based in Costa Rica. And the payroll now is almost the same as it was when Intel was manufacturing in Costa Rica, but it's now in the service side. So this is just an example of how sophisticated the services can become and how they have been replacing manufacturing. Now, I'm forgetting your second question was?
The democratic relationship.
Oh,
between,
yes. No, we can have strong relations with both China and the United States simultaneously. And we explain to all countries of the world what our positions are. Sometimes we have disagreements, but we are a country that is not going to get into entanglements that involve anything that's military or anything that's, displacing certain influences. But no, to answer your question, we have a healthy relationship with China, and we have a healthy relationship with the United States.
Yeah, but my concern is because China, Taiwan, and the U.S. they have a very sensitive triangle democratic relationship. So how do you balance among these three countries?
Well, we used to have our embassy in Taiwan, in Taipei, until 2007.
Yeah.
And then a decision was made that we would move our embassy to Beijing. And of course, that broke relations with Taiwan. So that was a big political, diplomatic decision that was made at the time, and which we maintain. But our relationship with the United States is another thing.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.